We will now be favored with a solo, Miss Marian Anderson.
He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the big round world in his hands. He's got the wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the moon and the stars in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. Oh, he's got everybody in his hands. He's got everybody in his hands. He's got everybody here, right in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
Welcome on this Valentine's Day Sunday at Wilshire Presbyterian Church. Usually on this Sunday we would have our friendship potluck. Well, spoiler alert, we will not be doing that today. Wonder why? Anyway, if you listened carefully to the song that was just playing into the intro, you would have recognized it. It is He Got the Whole World in His Hands. And you know, many of the popular songs that we know were originally hymns or spirituals. And they stay popular age after age, year after year, because they have this timeless message. And this specific ditty, He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, was the first time published in 1927 in a hymnal called Hymns Triumphant Old and New. So yes, it's an African American spiritual, and it has its origins in the Deep South. In fact, it is intertwined with the history of America. You know, and isn't it strange to think that the person who wrote the song, and we don't know who this was, just that it was somebody that is a slave, would write a song about God who has the whole world in God's hands. Just think about it. This person lived in a world where he or she wasn't considered even human, where slavery was considered a necessary evil. This is a person who had no control over their life. On a slave owner's whim, he could be beaten to the point of death. Or he or she could be sold on the auction block, or their kids be taken away from them and sold onto a different plantation. This person probably experienced trials and suffering that we today cannot even imagine. And yet that's the person who writes, God has the whole world in God's hands. You know, and as with spirituals, people tend to make it their own. They take it because the message is so timeless, and they apply it to their circumstances, what is true for them in their time. And so if you listened carefully to Marian Anderson singing, you would have heard her is a little bit of a different version. Now, for those of you who do not know who Marian Anderson is, she was the world famous contralto in the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, she sang to kings and queens. She sang in all the most important concert halls in Europe. in all the capitals. She could sing in Italian and Russian and German. And even at a very, very young age, people realized that she had incredible musical talent. At the age of 6, she sang in her church choir, not the children's choir, the adult choir. And around the age of 12, her dad died in an accident, and that plunged their family into poverty. And so her church raised the money to get her to get music lessons, just realizing what the phenomenal talent is that they had in their midst. In fact, later on in life, when she sang in Europe, a maestro would say hers is a voice that you hear only once in 100 years, because she could sing the deep D, but also a very, very high C. And so she moved in the 1920s, late middle 1920s, moved to Europe so that she could get more training, classical training, to be an opera singer. And Europe loved her. In fact, they say, like we get later in the 60s and 70s when the Beatles performed and people would just go crazy to see them. That's what happened in Europe when she sang in concert halls. In fact, people called it the Marian fever. So popular was she. But, by the middle 1930s, things in Europe started to sour. Nazism was spreading across Europe, and so she came back home. Now, Howard University in Washington, when she came back, when we can't let this opportunity go by. This is a renowned opera singer and concert artist, and so they invited her to come sing during a whole week of performances. I mean, here is the kid of a school teacher of the south side of Philadelphia, whose dad died when she was young. She grew up poor. Her dad was an ice deliverer, and she sang to kings and queens. Who would not want to hear her? And because she was so famous, they expected that a lot of people would come and hear her. And unfortunately, the concert hall on the campus was too small. So we looked around in Washington, D.C. and realized that the Constitution Hall would be big enough to hold a huge audience. And the Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So they contacted, her manager contacted them and said, can we do it here? And they said, no. No, because they had an all-white artist policy. Because don't forget, Marian Anderson lived in the 1930s when racism was overt, when Jim Crow was the law of the land, when separate fountains and lynching was commonplace. That's the world she lived in. Now, just before this whole thing happened, she was actually invited to the White House, and she was the first African American to perform in the White House, and she was invited by Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. And it seems that these two ladies just hit it off, because when Eleanor Roosevelt found out what happened and that the Daughters of the American Revolution refused Marian Anderson to perform at the Constitution Hall, she resigned from him. In fact, she publicly resigned. She talked about it in her weekly column called Our Day. Sort of like today, famous people and presidents and vice presidents and whatever would, comment on in their Twitter account. The First Lady had a column called My Day. And she said, I cannot stay in this organization because that would mean that I condone what they did. And when this leaked to the public, there was a huge outpour of support for Marian Anderson, and people were upset and up in ruckus. Now, of course, this whole protest is led by Eleanor Roosevelt. She's the one who leaked the story. She wanted people to know what happened. And so she decided in protest that she and the president, Franklin Roosevelt, is going to invite Marian Anderson to sing in the National Mall on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so on Easter Sunday, 1939, Marian Anderson performed for the first ever concert like that on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a whole concert, and 75,000 people showed up. It was the first of its kind. It was the first of this size of interracial audience, and it was sort of like a protest concert, where for the first time somebody on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial faced segregation and demanded for her voice to be heard. And if you watch a video material of her standing there right in front of President Lincoln's statue before she sings that first song, you can see how nervous she is. And she would wrap her coat around her as if that moment is so big, and it was big. Because see, that moment in time when she sang at the Lincoln Memorial cemented in time the relationship between the civil rights protests and marches and the National Mall. Because of that Sunday, after that, the Lincoln Memorial will become the place that was the focus of the civil rights protests and marches, including the most famous one, the one in 1963 with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Remember the one where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech? He stood on the very spot where Marian Anderson sang on Easter Sunday in 1939. And it wasn't by accident, it was chosen on purpose. He chose on purpose to have the end of the protest right there. And that became her legacy. After that day, Marian Anderson would become a household name. Everybody in America would know about her. That doesn't mean that she didn't still have to face a lot of obstacles and racism after that. That's not at all what it means. In fact, it took till 1955 that she became the first African American to sing at the New York Metropolitan Opera House, when she was past her prime as an opera singer, which just fills you with sadness. Yet she would go on and make, I think, 95 albums. She would sing at more than one president's inauguration. Noteworthy, President John F. Kennedy's inauguration, she would sing the national anthem. She would be a representative for the country at the United Nations. She would tour the world once again. So she had a full life after that, but not a life without obstacles. And so later on, when she decided to record He's Got the Whole World in His Hand, she chose a very specific version, and it was written by Hamilton Francis. And as I said earlier, people take this song and they just make it their own to speak to their circumstances. And later in her autobiography, she wrote why she chose this specific version of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand. And I read for you. She says, "This spiritual reminds us not to lose sight of the fact that we have our times of extremity, and that there is a being who can help us at such times. It takes in everybody." Who better to say that than she? You know, what I didn't share with you is that when she was 17 years old, her church kept on encouraging her, you need to do something with this talent. And they said, you should apply to the Philadelphia Academy of Music. And so she goes, and you know the church, they did a whole fundraiser, they collect money because this is very expensive. So 17-year-old, she shows up at the academy, and you know it's just a sea of white applicants. And they all go in front of her, one after the other, one after the other, one after the other, till there is nobody left except her. And she walks up and the woman asks, what do you want? And she goes, I want to apply to attend school here. And the woman looks at her and goes, we don't take coloreds. And Marian Anderson wrote that it felt like somebody hit her in the gut, that it just took her breath away. And that almost stop her career. It almost crushed her right there in that moment of rejection. And after that, many more rejections she would have to face until she took that brave step in her own money and decided to go to Europe to get the training and the education in music she needed that she couldn't get in the United States. You know, and even though she became very famous and popular in Europe, when Nazism started to spread, so did the sentiments in Europe. And even there, her career wasn't guaranteed and safe. And that's why she came back to the United States in the 30s. So this is the woman who sings, God has the whole world in God's hands. And it's because she had this deep faith. She understood something about God's presence in the world. So she says, and I continue to read, it takes in everybody. It speaks first of the wind and the rain. No one can stop the rain, no matter how rich or poor, brilliant or stupid he may be. He's got the lying man, he's got the gambling man, he's got the crap shooting man in his hands. That takes in most of the transgressors. And I love that about her. Here is a person that has experienced overt racism, who had to overcome quite a lot of obstacles in her life, unwarranted and many of them almost unsurmountable, to become the renowned and famous, powerful singer she was. And yet she says God holds everybody God's hands in God's hands, the good and the bad, the evil and the righteous. Sort of what Jesus taught us about God letting the sun come up over the righteous and the unrighteous. So as I said, people choose versions of the song because it speaks to their circumstances. And she goes on and she says, and then comes the little bit a baby. Who will protect them when mother and father can't? And you know her story by now. I shared that with you. When her dad died and they had to move in with family members, and she and her sisters and her mom all had to work to survive, it was her church that was there to encourage her and help financially secure her musical future for her. And then she says, then the next version reads, he got you and me, brother, in his hands. He got you and me, sister, in his hands. He got everybody here in his hands. He got the whole world in his hands. It is all there in the spiritual, she wrote. I chose it not alone because I thought the audience would like it, but because it had a cry, an appeal, a meaning to me. It is more, so much more than a number on a concert program. So if you haven't yet guessed it, she had a deep and abiding faith. And just as the unknown slave who wrote this spiritual amidst the suffering, amidst no promise for freedom, and that slave still believed that there is a loving God in control of the world, so did Marian believe that. And that is what gave her solace. She once wrote this about her faith and her music. She wrote, failure and frustration are in the unwritten pages of everyone's record. I had my share of them, which I just think is such an understatement. But if my mother's gentle hands were not there to guide me, perhaps my life in music would have ended a long time ago. The faith of my mother taught me it is my foundation. It is the only ground on which I stand. With it, I have freedom in life that I could have no other way. Whatever is in my voice, my faith has put it there. You see, she truly believed that her voice was a direct gift from God. And for her, singing was a deeply religious experience. If you look at old films of her singing, you will see that most of the times when she sings, her eyes are closed. Faith was her foundation. Her handbook was scripture, where it is full of stories of people who face adversity and trials and struggling and suffering, and all of them go through the same process of doubting and asking, where is God in all this, and why is God not doing something, and why is my life not getting better? And all of them in the end find solace, and God finds strength in their faith, and see God in control of everything behind all of this. And this is what Marian saw too. It is what that slave saw. It is what Jesus understood. It is what Paul understood. We've been reading through, as a congregation, through the Bible, and during the pandemic, we've been reading the Psalms, Proverbs, and now Job, and the book of Ecclesiastes. And the Psalms are songs. They are the songs of people singing their journey. It's the songs, and when they ask God, where have you been? Why are you not answering my prayer? Psalm 22, why have you forsaken me, God? And then they all end in the same way, this absolute assurance and solace that God is still there, even when in this here and now it doesn't look like that. And if you look in the Psalms, in the middle there's this group of Psalms. They clump together, and it's called the Psalms of Ascent. It's about 15 of them. Actually, it is 15. It's Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. And they're called Psalms of Ascent because when people traveled to Jerusalem for the big three feasts of the year, especially Passover, they would sing and recite these psalms on their way to Jerusalem. And since Jerusalem is on a mountain, you ascend to Jerusalem, hence the ascent song. But not only that, when they got to Jerusalem, they would ascend up the stairs of the temple, the 7 stairs. And it is said that as they stepped on every step, they would stop and they would recite one of these ascent psalms all the way up to the temple. And that's what we did when we visited Israel, not all of them. And it's what Jesus did in that last week of his life. He would go up that stairs and he would recite these songs. And I can just think how they resonated with him. The Lord, I am suffering, where are you? Lord, are you going to answer my prayer? Full knowing that his enemies were converging in Jerusalem, that they wanted to get rid of him. Full knowing that there was no way he's going to escape what is going to happen. Full knowing what is waiting for him at the end of that week. Full knowing sort of what the slave rider knew when he was writing, God has the whole world in his hands. This is not a slave that thought he's going to be, or she's going to be free. They knew what the rest of their life would be looking like. There was no promise of freedom. Even for Marian Anderson, who became renowned, she knew racism wasn't going to disappear, and suddenly she will be treated with equality and justice and the respect she should be afforded. And yet she wanted to sing this song. I personally think that if this song was written in the time of the Bible, it would have been a psalm. In fact, there's a psalm in these Psalms of Ascent. And listen, and you'll realize, it says the same thing as this spiritual, he's got the whole world in his hands. So I'm read from Psalm 121. It says, I look up to the mountains. Does my strength come from mountains? No, my strength comes from God, who made heaven and earth and mountains. He won't let you stumble. Your guardian God won't fall asleep. Not on your life, Israel. Your guardian never dozes or sleep. God's your guardian, right at your side to protect you, shielding you from sunstroke, sheltering you from moonstroke. God guards you from every evil. He guards your very life. He guards you when you leave and when you return. He guards you now. He guards you always. Amen. And you think to yourself, that's what Jesus is reciting as he walked up the steps of the southern side of the temple, knowing that by the end of the week he will be hanging on a cross. He's got the whole world in his hands. That is a song that a slave writes that knows he or she will never escape slavery. This is the song Marian Anderson chooses to sing and record, even though she knows she's not going to escape the racism of early 20th century America. But this song, God has the whole world in his God's hand, and Psalm 121 does something for us. It helps us to look up from looking down and getting so stuck in our circumstances, and look up and see more. See that there is more to this world than just our personal circumstances. That behind all of this is God, the Creator. It helps us to see that even though in the moment it looks like evil have the upper hand, that injustice rules, that racism is in control, that suffering is never ending. What this song and Psalm 121 reminds us is that God has the last word. Not death, not evil, not injustice, not suffering, not racism, not even the pandemic. God has the last word. The Apostle Paul understood that. Remember that just amazing words he says to us in Romans 8 verse 35, and I'm going to read it, but I know you know this, I hope, by heart, because this is the one you want to recite when you having struggled to look up out of your circumstances and see something much bigger than yourself. In Romans 8 verse 35 to 39, Paul writes, "Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? No, in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in creation will be able to separate us from God, and able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." See, that's what Marian Anderson understood. That's what Paul understood. That is what Jesus understood. That is what the psalm writer understood. That is what the slave understood that who wrote, he's got the whole world in his hands. In fact, a current day renowned soprano, an opera singer, she is a black Canadian singer. She's called Misha Brugger-Gossman, who sees Marian Anderson as one of her heroes, and understand that Marian has opened the way after her for quite a lot of people. But she shares something else with Marian, the same deep fighting faith. And when she talks about Marian, I read this really good description, that she explains how she knows Marian saw the world, because she sees the world the same way through her lens of faith. And she writes, "The world we live in is in deep emergency, in deep sorrow, in deep pain. But the beauty of salvation is that all of this is true, and yet God is still on the throne. In spite of all we see and experience, God is still on the throne." What you may not know is that in 1939, on Easter Sunday, when Marian Anderson was singing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, in the audience was a 10-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King. And years later, with the March on Washington, he was the one who invited Marian Anderson to come to the march and sing at the end of the march, when it ends at the National Mall at the Lincoln Memorial. And so he, on purpose, stood on the very spot where she sang. And after he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, it was Marian's turn to sing. And she sang to that 250,000 crowd, who themselves were in the throes of racism and injustice, and were standing there to make their voice heard and stand up against segregation. To all of them she sang, "He's got the whole wide world in his hands. So the recording we listened to at the beginning of the intro, that recording was from that day when she was singing it. And she gave that timeless message that fitted so well with Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And it was a message that all of those watching her needed to hear, and even us today, as we face our own struggles today, that God is on the throne, that God has the whole world in God's hands. And so about a year ago in March, when the pandemic broke out, a well-known African-American filmmaker, Tyler Perry, I'm sure you're all familiar with him, sat down and on his Twitter account put out an invitation for people, for artists, to respond to the situation by giving their own version of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand. Tyler Perry said, this song is what we need right now, the message of this song that gives us hope and peace amidst everything that's going on, everything that feels so out of control, and everything that have passed or transpired in this past year, to remember that God has the whole world in God's hands. So he put out the word on Twitter and says, come give your version, your rendering of the song and send it back to me. And people did. And afterwards he put out a compilation of it on YouTube. And so what we're going to do for you now, we're going to show you a little bit of it. But in the description part of this video, you will see a link to it. You can see it all, because amazing artists like Jennifer Hudson responded to me, and it is just gives you chills to hear them. And so I want you to listen to it, and then I'll talk about it again.
I'm gonna start this song, and then I want all of y'all to add to it, all the musicians out there, all the singers out there. Change the key, take it up. Yeah, let's see if I can do this. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. Where you at? Y'all had something.
He's got you and me, brother, sister, in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
He's got the believers and unbelievers in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
He's got the little bitty babies in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. My God has got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got all of his children in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
So Tyler said his wish was that this song would just spread across the world in all languages and cultures, and it will become a prayer for the world, so that we all can be pulled out of the here and the now of the pandemic and everything that came with it, and make us look up and see the God who holds the world in God's hands. We're going to listen now to a rendition by our own quartet of He's Got a Whole World in His Hand. And I invite you to come up with your own rendition that speaks to you, your situation. That's after all what Spirituals does. It speaks to the hardship in our own lives. So make the song your own. Add the words you think will speak to your circumstances. And if you want to know a little bit more about Marian Anderson and her amazing legacy, there is on Amazon a documentary about her called Once in 100 Years, The Life and Legacy of Marian Anderson. And then, believe it or not, this is not planned, but tomorrow night, Monday night the 15th on PBS, there is a new documentary on her that will be aired that is called Voice of Freedom. Here is WPC singing He's Got the Whole World in His Hand.
got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole 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 wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the little bitty baby in his hands. He's got the little bitty baby in his hands. He's got the little bitty baby in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
On Easter 1939, Marian Anderson sung on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial after the Daughters of the American Revolution barred her from performing at the Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., solely because she was black. Some 75,000 people gathered to hear Marian Anderson perform that day. It would become the first protest concert of its kind and set the Lincoln Memorial as the stage for many civil rights protests to come.